Hey, what's up? This is Scott with Level Up Tutorials, and today we're going to be talking about this massive discussion that took place 8 days ago. And this thing was wild. There was a lot of people complaining, a lot of opinions, a lot of really helpful posts, and the community really kind of came together in a way to talk about how to improve SvelteKit before version 1.0. Because let's face it, when this thing hits 1.0, any API change that you have made is kind of set in stone for a little while. Because nobody wants a major breaking change after version 1.0 just dropped. So any major change that needs to take place, it needs to take place before any version 1.0 hits. And that's an important thing to know, is that if there's going to be major changes, now is the time to do it as we get closer to launch. And this might upset people who have been, early adopters of SvelteKit. I myself have released several courses on SvelteKit and done all sorts of writing. I have a massive SvelteKit application. So if there is anyone who should be upset by these changes, maybe it should be me, because I've been doing so much SvelteKit content that is now going to go out the window. And not only that, but I have a giant application here that is now going to have a major migration. But if you are waiting for me to be upset about these changes, you will be waiting a long time, because I really like just about every single one of these changes. Now I'm going to actually, before I get into the SvelteKit, I'm going to say I made my video really small in the corner here because I scratched my eye and it looks really gnarly. So I don't want to subject you to gnarly eyes, so I'm just going to make me really small. Just in case you're wondering about that. If you're not, who cares? We're going to be diving in this video, and we're going to be talking all about these changes. We're going to be talking about the what's and whys behind them. We're going to be getting into functionally what the changes are, and maybe why you should hold off some of your rage. Now, if you have rage and you have, don't have rage, first of all. It's an open source project, right? Don't have rage. That's out of control. What you should have, maybe you're concerned. Let's say if you have concern, post in the description if you're concerned about it. Say, hey, I'm concerned. Don't say I'm angry and I hate this or whatever, because that's not helpful, right? But these changes are coming whether you hate them or not. And I personally, I'm not going to try to convince you to not hate them, but I will tell you about why I like them. So basically, we have the TLDR here, as they say, is that there is some confusion. And when people are learning SvelteKit, there's confusion around a number of things. And as a teacher of SvelteKit, I see a lot of this in comments, or even personally when I'm trying to dive in on topics, I see confusion and I talk to people. And I know that there is confusion around the routing system. There's confusion around the loading function. There's a lot of confusion, and I'll talk a little bit about some of this stuff. Now, SvelteKit, for the most part, is an extremely simple experience, but I think it's largely a simple experience because Svelte is a simple experience, and Svelte is powerful without having to do a whole lot. But that doesn't mean that SvelteKit couldn't be made better in those regards. And I think that these changes will be making SvelteKit better in those regards. Some of the stuff is a little scary. You're going to notice some things that we'll call out as being scary, like the plus symbol in here. But those things, to me, I think all come at what is, in my opinion, a benefit to the user who's writing things. So some of why they're doing this is the folder structure based routing system. So we have right now, as it works, a folder structure based routing system that includes folders and files and has some magical file names where we have __ error for an error page, or __ layout for a layout page. We have an index page that, although that is a normal thing in HTML, right? We have an index page where this index page is essentially at the same routing level as a thing that is in a folder below it, so to say. So this might not make sense in the root, but let's say we have an about.svelte file. This about.svelte file is at the same level as the tutorials.index file, even though the tutorials.index file lives inside of a directory. And I know that's how the web works, but that does feel kind of weird when you're trying to evaluate all of your routes, especially when you're looking at them. When you're looking at them, we have tutorials and we have about. And they're separated. They're not alphabetically connected in any sort of way. And what you're saying is we now have two ways to make a route. We have a folder to make a route, and we have a file to make a route. And this, at its core, seems like it's very normal behavior because we've been writing code for like this for so long. But when you dive into limiting routes to being just folders, it opens up a ton of really wonderful magic. And some people don't like magic, but if you don't like magic, maybe Svelte isn't the right language for you. There's a fair amount of magic here, and that's not a bad thing, in my opinion. I think it's wonderful. We're now going to be able to have some of that magic in how we lay out our folders and files. It also means that we couldn't in the past easily co-locate components inside of our routes folder. And many people, their response to that is, I don't do that. I don't do that anyway, so why should I have to care about this? But when you have a large project, and I'm going to show you this, when you have a large project, let's say I get into tutorials, I'm working in the tutorials, let's go to my tslug file, and I say, all right, I want to edit the tutorial main. So then I hold my option key and I click it, and now I'm all of a sudden, I've been transported to a completely different structure of the folder of my application, despite the fact that this tutorial's main file component only ever is loaded up on a tutorial route. Now, it makes a lot of sense to have reusable components live elsewhere, but for components that are only used on an individual given page, it doesn't necessarily make that much sense not to co-locate them. I personally will be looking forward to co-locating these files in a better way. Personally, it's not something I currently do. And sorry for all this red here, by the way. We're in the middle of a redesign. So this is a UI v4 branch that is definitely in major flux right now. But I'm looking forward to co-locating my components. So you'll now be able to co-locate your components just by moving your component into a folder without the Svelte Kit router assuming that your component is a route. So that's a big one. Let's dive into what some of these changes are specifically before we get into one. I'll touch on the whys while we're talking about the changes specifically, because I think this is a lot of the why are we doing this stuff. So let's talk first about the routing, okay? Because that's where we kind of been talking already. First and foremost, routes are now going to be defined as folders. So no longer are pages or individual .svelte files going to define essentially a route, which seems like it's a step backwards, but it's going to mean that there's now one way to do this thing. The one way to do this thing is to define the route as a folder. Inside of that folder are magic files and then non-magic files. Our magic files are those of which that begin with a prefix. Whereas before we had, index.svelte or __ layout or any kind of magic file or file that's doing more than one thing, all just kind of willy-nilly. We had .json.js files in there, right? And those weren't easily identified, right? Because it's almost like the ending of the file, or in some cases, the beginning of the file. And it was kind of willy-nilly in terms of what makes one of those files special. In fact, they're all just kind of special by existing inside of the routes folder unless you had an underscore in front of it. So therefore, what we're now able to say is that any file with a plus in front of it is going to now be essentially a special file. These special files can be anything from a server-side only API route that basically serves up data as a public API, or a data loading route which passes data into a Svelte component, or a page specifically, or a layout. And a layout encompasses all sub-pages of a specific route. So layouts and pages are going to work the exact same way. They're just now going to be named plus layout.svelte for a layout page instead of __, and then plus page.svelte instead of index.svelte or a folder and an index.file or about.svelte. So what this is it's going to simplify again by making all of our pages plus page.svelte. Okay. Now some people will say, oh, this is a bummer because now we're going to have 1,000 page.svelte files. But I encourage you, in fact, Rich posted a video showing how easy it is to search for files this way. I encourage you to, I know there's a setting in VS Code. We'll do settings, open UI, file. I think it's there's a setting in VS Code, and let me find it. Label format controls the format of the label in an editor. And I have mine set to short. This is something that you can set yourself. But what this does is now if we have an index file, it says index.svelte tutorials right next to it. And that way, if you have 1,000 page files open at once, you can easily identify between them. That said, you should probably be closing your tabs. Look at how many tabs I have open. I should probably be closing some of these because you really... It's probably intensive on your CPU, and you don't need to have that many things open at once anyways. But either way, you'll be able to have that label name directly there. So that's certainly a fix for those of you who are concerned about it. But also the plus makes finding things really easy, as Rich shows in his video. So people are concerned that there's a now magic character plus, right? Why is this thing plus? Why is this... I think there's a bit of confusion on both parts. One is like, I wish this was index.svelte instead of page.svelte. That's fine. I can get that. But I think page is more descriptive than index. And just because we know index already doesn't mean that it's a better solution. It just means it's a different solution. You can have different thoughts on that, whatever. So page versus index is one argument. Another argument is why have a symbol in front of it at all? And if we're having a symbol, why not have it be an underscore, considering we already use underscores? Well, that gets into quite a bit instead of the Y plus part here, where he's talking quite a bit about how underscore is a well-established thing that means private. And what we'll be doing by using an underscore is saying these are private files inherently, even if you don't feel that way personally, just based on programming history. So we don't want to do that, right? So he took some time, and the community took some time to evaluate all of these different options. Things like the $ needing to be escaped in the terminal, and all of these options had some kind of iffy use cases except for plus, which is a small character. It kind of gets out of the way. It's one of the lowest, or might be the lowest in terms of like pixel per black pixels, as it says, which is, it's funny, but it's actually very, very relevant because you don't want the symbol to get in the way, and the symbol gets out of the way. It also has no established prior meaning. It doesn't have any baggage attached to it. There's people aren't going to be coming this from other systems being like, oh, I know what the plus means. They now can say like, oh, yeah, the plus, that makes sense. And people are even saying, why don't we make this configurable? No, we don't need to do that. We don't need to make that makes no sense to me at all. But let's not make this any more fractured or whatever. Let's just say plus is the magic symbol. Rip that band-aid off. Everybody's using plus, okay? So again, we have some special file names now where we can say plus page or plus layout, whatever. Those indicate that these things are going to be loaded up as part of the route, whether that is an endpoint, whether that's a page, whether that's a layout. These things are now all indicated by a plus, and if it doesn't have a plus in front of it, it's not anything. It's going to be ignored entirely by the routing structure, and therefore we can load that thing up as a collocated component. Gotta love it. Okay, so endpoints here. Now, endpoints in the past have been a number of different ways, whether or not you're passing in data to the component or you're loading up a JSON file. And we even had at one point, you always had to load up your data from a JSON file, just like you did in Sapper. And then we got what are called shadow endpoints, or they're not called shadow endpoints, actually. They maybe were briefly, but man, some people like me just can't get that out of their head for some reason because it's a cool name. Basically, you had endpoints that just pass data directly into a component without having to need that extra step in there. And so the history of endpoints have always been kind of interesting, but now we have essentially a decent way of working in it. But what we're going to have is a really nice way of working in it, because what you can define is basically some data that only loads on the server. Now, what's interesting here is that you'll end up having multiple ways of doing your server-side data, of which they make perfect sense. One of which is going to be a plus page.server.js or TS, and that is going to be your page or your layout.server.js's data for the server. This is going to be data that you're loading up on the server side, passing directly into your component as data. So anytime you need server-specific code, this is where you'll run it. And that's awesome that it's .server.js or TS, because that makes it very explicit what's going on there. It's really great, actually. And this is one of the changes that I'm looking forward to quite a bit, even though I don't do a ton of server-side stuff with our Svelte Kit app, considering we're using our GraphQL API. But I do think this is a big improvement here. And we're able to now essentially run server-side code very explicitly and have that passed along into our component as an endpoint. Now, this endpoint code is going to have a lot of neat little changes into it as well in terms of simplifying git, post, put, patch, delete, any of that stuff, whatever. It's all going to work a little bit nicer. Now, in addition to that, you're also going to have just a straight up server.js file or TS file that would then be loaded inside of a folder such as foo.json as the route. So now if you want to have a public API where the public API is loading up JSON, you have a folder that is .json, which is admittedly a little weird, and then a plus server.js file inside of that. This route right here might be the weirdest route in these new changes. If you're saying like, what is the weirdest thing in these new changes? This might be it right here for me, but I can't get that mad at it for some reason, because I have seen some gnarly looking API routes, and this document even gets into that a little bit about API routes and folder-based routing and how you can get pretty gnarly sometimes. So this to me, not that scary when I have seen much scarier already. Now, the new load API is a big part of this. This is one of these things that people are confused by when they head into SvelteKit. In fact, let me fire up a page here, just any old page. And like when I say any old page, I mean any old page, because what we have here is we have first and foremost a script with a context of module. And inside of that, we have a special function that can run client side or server side. And then that then passes in data or a response to another script tag where we're actually doing our logic. And then we have our templating stuff. That right there, I think illustrates exactly the confusion around this. One, why do we need context module here? Why do we need two script tags? How do we run this code only on the server side? What are all these things we can do here? And basically what they're doing is replacing context module into moving it into its own file, where this will now be just simply page.js or TS or layout.js or TS. So now you have a page.svelte and a page.ts, or a page.svelte and a page.ts or JS. I'll just say TS from now on. So page.svelte, page TS, okay? And page.ts is going to be the file that loads your data. Page.svelte is going to be your templating. And this to me is a big win, not for just moving this stuff out of my components, which is fine. I don't mind it being in here, but it's going to be a win for teaching SvelteKit, because now I don't have to say, here we have a script with a context module. It needs to be context module because we need to be able to export something and have it being usable outside of this thing. And it's all about the internals of SvelteKit and how it works, rather than, hey, I have essentially a load function, then here's what the load function does, and it passes data along to the props. Now, in addition, the load function itself is also getting a major rework, and this is one for the better. One small thing here is that inside of our context.module in the past, we could do things like export const SSR equals false or preload equals true, whatever, to control preloading and SSR a page or layout base, right? And that got actually changed, and we had to do that inside of our hooks file. But the hooks file was never like a great API, because if you use the hooks file, you'll know that you had to do like, all right, only SSR for pages when it's not in testing and the event URL or the page does not start with admin. Oh, okay. Like, this to me is not a great API compared to export SSR equals false. Like, that's way nicer. But we lost that ability because it just didn't work well. It wasn't able to be as flexible as we needed it to be. So they were able to basically reinstate this inside of our component. Yes. Now I'm so excited to have this back. It's one of my favorite things about this new API is that this works. So this is proof that you can take something away from me that I really like. You can make a bunch of changes, but as long as you give me back the thing I like, I'm going to be happy. That's obviously just a joke, but it's true. You know, I think there's a lot of good changes here. So what are the changes to the load function exactly? In the past, they had all these things: URL, fetch, path, param, session, stuff. Stuff is kind of always been weird. Stuff is for stuff. It's for stuff. I actually use it to pass data upwards from a component to a layout, which is fine, but it's not great. I never loved it. So stuff is going to be going bye-bye. They're removing stuff status and error, and props is being renamed to data, which I think makes sense, because what is a prop? It's, you know, holdover from component-based anything, but it's data. We're passing data back and forth. Data makes more sense, right? It's a more agnostic and universal term that can be used more consistently throughout the design. Perfectly encapsulated, right? And there's also a change coming here where depends allows a load function to declare dependency on a specific resource, replacing dependencies. Again, this is not something that I've used, and it says it's only necessary in niche circumstances. So this one's whatever for me. But instead of all this stuff, what we're getting here is basically depends and set headers. Set headers is going to allow us to do caching the way that you would expect to on the platform, the web platform. You can now set your headers, including cache control or any other headers that you may need to set yourself. That seems like a big win to me, that just have set headers as a function available here, available as an input, instead of having to do it as an output, right? Now, the things that are changed in output is that outputs have changed substantially, and for the better, mind you. In the past, we had to do a redirect, a status, an error, cache stuff, or dependencies. And now we don't have to do any of those things anymore, which honestly sounds awesome to me. So stuff is going bye-bye. Cache, we can now set by setting our own headers instead of just returning a cache property in an object, which instead of using the Svelte Kit platform, we're using the web platform, right? Which is a plus in my mind. It's a plus in front of a file system in my mind. We also have error, which we no longer are returning an error or a status code or a redirect to do those types of things. But get it, we are going to now throw an error, because that's what you do with errors, right? You throw an error. You don't return an error in an object. That makes way more sense to me as well. In addition, so now instead of returning a object that has a props property and then that value inside of the props property, what we now have is now we're going to have just return straight up the data. And that data is now going to be available to your components as the export prop of data. So you can see here, here's an example of throwing errors in our load function. If the user is not authorized, we can throw a 401 here instead of returning something. And this allows us to exit out of this thing early, nice and easy. And honestly, this API change is very big for me. I like that one quite a bit. We no longer have to worry about that. You can also throw a redirect, which is interesting as well. You can throw a 307 redirect. That makes sense to me. We have also, if you pass in your data, in the past, what you did is you had your props inside of an object, and then each of those props had to then be export let the prop name in your component. But now we don't have to do that. We simply just say export let data, and all of the props become available as data. In addition to that, all of the props just being available as data, you also get all of the data passed into a page store named page.data. Now, I don't want to claim that Svelte Kit was inspired by jQuery at all here, because I can very much assure you that they most likely were not. But this is how jQuery works. We load all of our data server side, we pass it into a store, we make that data available as a store. Therefore, anytime we want to access the data, we don't even have to deal with props. We just load up that store, fire in the data, and you know it's accurate. That's something that we've been doing for a long time with jQuery on our site. And so the fact that Svelte Kit now has it kind of validates my design choice there. Because at first I was like, nobody's doing this. Why isn't anybody doing this? And now here we are. Svelte Kit itself is doing this. So really interesting stuff here. Next, we have the page.server.js and layout.server.js API. Basically, this allows us to have endpoints that pass data directly in as props or as data, and you can do so directly with a server-side get function. You can see export function get, or export function post, or export function put patch delete. Now, I think the most interesting one of these, and if it can be considered the most interesting, would be this post one, because in this example here, what you're able to do is export form method post, and then that's it, right? And this form this is going to be using the platform, right? This is going to send a post request to essentially the post that exists inside of page.server.js. So if you are working in forms a lot, you want to do something, you're sending to a post request, this is going to do it directly. I don't know if I've seen like a JavaScript-based post request that's as simple as this outside of Remix. And Remix does it very similarly to this. I would have to imagine this was inspired by Remix, because this feels very much like how they handle post requests, which is one of my favorite things about Remix. which is weird to say that you have a favorite thing and it's how they handle post requests. Okay. Lastly, we have the plus server.js API. This is basically for if you need to expose your public API. We already talked about this very briefly. Now, this post, I will say, has garnered a lot of attention, so much so that it needed to be locked and just say, hey, here's where we're going to do it. There's a lot of people still making the same arguments over and over again, and I see them constantly on Discord or on the other people are opening up new discussions to say this and that, blah, blah, blah. Like, man, I think they did a pretty good job making their case here. And if you're not convinced by these changes and them being for the better, I can get that. I can get that you think they're a little scary. But I would highly recommend reading essentially this one that says updated, this post right here. This post goes into quite a bit about why they chose the symbol that they chose, exclusionary versus inclusionary, file finding, ambiguity. They talk about this Rich Hickley simplicity talk, which I'll load up there's a YouTube video of this talk. I'll make this available. I highly recommend watching this talk. It talks a lot about simplicity and the idea of that we have about simplicity and how basically the things will change, right? This is the old way of having it. This is the new way of having it. And I honestly think one of the nicest things in here is this little 10-second video that shows how easy it is to find files with a plus inside of them and why that's a nice actual label for a file name. So we now have magic file names as if we didn't before. We did. People are saying, why not plus? Well, it's no different than underscore. It means less implied things than an underscore means, and it gets out of the way. So in case you can't tell by this, I like these changes, and I would go as far as saying I love these changes. I cannot wait to implement them, but I do have a lot of work. So it's putting a lot of work in front of me. I have to rewrite a lot of our app. I have to rewrite a lot of our tutorials. But again, I think this is going to be an improved experience. And if we're going to have our experiences improve before launch, now is the time to do them. Let me know. Sound off in the comments. Be nice. Don't be rude about any of the updates or the changes or whatever. Be nice. Just let me know what you think. Let me know if you're excited for these changes. Let me know if this video helped convince you at all. Again, I'm not trying to convince you. I just want to explain some of these things. I have no part in this. I had no part in the decision to make any of these changes. I am the tutorial guy. I just wait for the stuff. I wait for the slop to come down the line and then I slop it up. That's what I do. So thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next week. We're going to be doing some code blogging on the new Level Up tutorial site, which, mind you, is coming along quite well. We've been doing quite a bit of work on this thing, and this isn't even the latest version of this, in case you're wondering. This is just whatever I have up right now. This is the new site, and it's going really, really well. I'm going to have to show you all sorts of cool stuff that's coming along in the new site, and we're going to be talking about some of the tools or new things that we've used to build this site with, but we're also going to be talking about some of the open source projects like BooKit and how I've been using BooKit to write my components. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.